Miss Marple and the Grave Robber of St Mary Mead, narrated by Edward from Warm Pages. I'm glad you're here with us tonight. Before we begin, here's a little riddle for you. The more you take from me, the bigger I get. What am I? Share your guesses in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for new mysteries every day. Now, let's begin uncovering tonight's chilling tale. Chapter 1. Night Lanterns. The September evening had settled over St Mary Mead with that particular quality of light that suggested summer's reluctant surrender to autumn. Miss Jane Marple, walking stick in hand, made her way along the familiar path that skirted the village green, her companion Mrs Dolly Bantry keeping pace beside her with the easy rhythm of long friendship. "Such a lovely time of year, don't you think, Jane?" Mrs Bantry remarked, adjusting her cardigan against the cooling air. "Though I must say the evenings are drawing in rather more quickly than I'd like." Miss Marple nodded, her keen blue eyes taking in the familiar sights of her beloved village. The cottages stood neat and tidy in their gardens, windows beginning to glow with the warm light of lamps being lit for the evening. It was the sort of peaceful scene that had remained unchanged for generations, the kind that made one feel that nothing truly dramatic could ever disturb the tranquil rhythm of village life. They had chosen to take the longer route home from the vicarage, where they had spent a pleasant afternoon helping Mrs Clement sort through donations for the harvest festival. The path led them past St Mildred's churchyard, where the ancient yew trees stood sentinel over generations of St Mary Mead's departed. "Oh, look there," Mrs Bantry said suddenly, pointing toward the shadowy expanse of the cemetery. "Is that a light among the trees?" Miss Marple paused, following her friend's gaze. Indeed, there was a flickering yellow glow moving slowly between the weathered headstones, bobbing gently as though carried by someone picking their way carefully through the uneven ground. "How very odd," Miss Marple murmured, her voice carrying that particular note of interest that Mrs Bantry had learned to recognise over the years. One would hardly expect anyone to be visiting graves at this hour. The light appeared to pause near the far end of the churchyard, close to where the newer section bordered the old glebe-land. For a moment it remained stationary, then began to move again in a slow, methodical pattern that suggested someone searching for something specific. "Perhaps it's the sexton," Mrs Bantry suggested, though her tone indicated she found this explanation less than convincing. "Jonah Styles sometimes works late, doesn't he?" "Indeed he does," Miss Marple agreed, but her eyes remained fixed on the mysterious light. "Though I rather think Jonah would use one of those modern electric torches, don't you?" "That looks distinctly like a storm lantern to me." The two ladies stood watching for several more minutes, but the light had disappeared completely, swallowed by the deeper shadows among the yew trees. The churchyard lay peaceful and still once more, with only the gentle rustling of leaves in the evening breeze to disturb the silence. "Well," said Mrs Bantry with a slight shiver, "I suppose it's none of our business really. Shall we continue on?" But Miss Marple found herself glancing back over her shoulder as they walked away, a small frown creasing her brow. There had been something about the way that light moved, so purposeful and yet secretive, that struck her as distinctly unusual. In her experience, people who had legitimate business in churchyards rarely felt the need to conduct it by lantern light after dark. The next morning brought one of those crisp, clear days that September sometimes offered as compensation for summer's departure. Miss Marple was in her garden, deadheading the last of the roses, when she heard the sound of hurried footsteps on the gravel path. Looking up, she saw Jonah Styles approaching her gate, his weathered face wearing an expression of considerable agitation. "Miss Marple," he called out, touching his cap respectfully, "begging your pardon, but I wondered if you might spare a moment. There's been some trouble up at the church, and I'm that upset about it." Miss Marple set down her secateurs and came to the gate, noting that Jonah's usual composure seemed thoroughly shaken. The sexton was a man of perhaps 60, built like an oak tree and normally as unflappable as one. To see him in such a state was unusual indeed. "Of course, Mr. Styles," she said gently. "What seems to be the matter?" "It's the churchyard, miss," Jonah said, twisting his cap in his hands. Someone's been at the graves, 3 of them, disturbed in the night they were. Proper upset I am about it." Miss Marple felt a sharp prick of interest. "Disturbed, you say?" "In what way?" "Stones pried up, earth dug about," Jonah explained, his voice thick with indignation. "But here's the queer thing, Miss Marple. Whoever did it wasn't after the usual. Mrs. Henderson's diamond brooch was still pinned to her shroud, plain as day. Old Mr. Tompkins' gold watch and chain, untouched. Even poor Sarah Wickham's emerald ring still on her finger it was." "How very strange," Miss Marple murmured. "What was taken then?" "That's just it, miss. Nothing valuable. Not in the usual way of thinking. Just the nameplates off the coffins, the brass ones with the particulars engraved, and bits of metal from the monuments. Nothing anyone would call precious." Miss Marple's mind was already working, filing away this curious information alongside her memory of the previous evening's mysterious lantern. "Have you reported this to Inspector Slack?" "Aye, that I have. He's coming out this morning to have a look. The Reverend's in a right state about it all, as you might imagine. Says it's desecration, pure and simple." "And you don't agree?" Jonah shifted uncomfortably. "Well, miss, it's not my place to say, but whoever did this knew their way about graves. Neat work it was in its way. Not the sort of wild damage you'd expect from vandals or treasure hunters." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She'd noticed something else about Jonah that struck her as worth remembering. A fine dusting of what looked like pale powder on his coat cuff, and when he moved his hands she caught the faint scent of stone dust and metal polish. "Mr. Styles," she said carefully, "you've been cleaning the monuments recently, haven't you?" The sexton looked surprised. "Why, yes, miss. How did you—" "Yes, I have been. Getting them ready for the harvest festival, giving the brasswork a proper polish. Old Mr. Pembury's been helping me with some of the restoration work on the damaged stones." Before Miss Marple could ask anything further, the sound of voices carried across from the direction of the church. Other villagers, drawn by word of the disturbance, were beginning to gather. "I'd better get back," Jonah said, replacing his cap. "Inspector Slack will want to speak with me again, I expect." As Miss Marple watched him hurry away, she found herself thinking about the pattern of what had been taken and what had been left behind. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that people's choices, even criminal ones, usually followed a certain logic. The question was what sort of logic would lead someone to steal worthless brass plates while leaving genuine valuables untouched. She made her way slowly back to her cottage, her mind already beginning to sort through the various threads of this curious puzzle. The mysterious lantern, the selective theft, Jonah's obvious distress, and most intriguingly, that fine coating of stone dust on his cuff that suggested he had indeed been cleaning monuments, but perhaps not entirely in the way one might expect. By the time she reached her front door, Miss Marple had come to one firm conclusion. Whatever was happening in St. Mildred's churchyard, it was considerably more complicated than a simple case of grave robbing. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows among the yew trees where, unbeknownst to the gathering villagers, someone had been very busy indeed rewriting the careful records of the dead. Chapter 2. Opened Earth. Inspector Slack arrived at St. Mildred's churchyard with his customary air of brisk efficiency, though Miss Marple, who had positioned herself discreetly near the lich gate, detected a note of genuine puzzlement beneath his professional manner. The inspector was a capable man, if somewhat inclined to rush toward obvious conclusions, and she could see that this particular case was not presenting him with the straightforward criminal behaviour he preferred to deal with. "Right then, Styles," Inspector Slack was saying to the sexton as Miss Marple approached. "Show me exactly what we're dealing with here." Jonah led the small group that had gathered, the inspector, Dr. Haydock, Reverend Clement, and several curious villagers, toward the affected graves. Miss Marple followed at a respectful distance, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The 3 disturbed graves lay in the older section of the churchyard, where the headstones bore the weathered inscriptions of centuries past. Each grave showed the same peculiar pattern of disturbance. The heavy stone slabs had been carefully pried up at the head end, just enough to allow access to the coffin beneath. but the work had been done with what could only be described as professional precision. "Look here," Jonah was explaining, kneeling beside the nearest grave. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were about. See these marks along the edge? That's from a proper crowbar, applied at just the right points. No damage to the stone itself, mind you. Takes skill, that does." Dr. Haydock bent down to examine the pry marks more closely. "Remarkably neat work," he agreed, "almost surgical in its precision." "That's what troubles me," said Reverend Clement, wringing his hands. "This wasn't the work of common vandals. Vandals would have smashed things, made a mess. This is something else entirely." Inspector Slack straightened up, brushing dirt from his knees. "Well, whatever their methods, they're thieves pure and simple. Question is, what were they after that was worth this much trouble?" It was then that Mrs. Letitia Northcott arrived, having hurried from her cottage upon hearing the news. A thin, nervous woman in her 60s, she'd been recently widowed and was still wearing full mourning dress. Her face was pale with distress as she approached the group. "Oh, Inspector," she cried, clutching her black-gloved hands together. "I knew this would happen. I felt it in my bones. Someone's after my poor Arthur, aren't they? Even in death they won't leave him be." Now, Mrs. Northcott," Dr. Haydock said kindly. "Your husband's grave hasn't been touched. These are all much older burials." But Mrs. Northcott was not to be comforted. "It doesn't matter which graves they start with," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Mark my words, they'll work their way through the whole churchyard. No one's safe, not even the dead." Miss Marple found herself studying the woman's face with interest. In her experience, extreme reactions often concealed important information, whether the speaker realized it or not. Mrs. Northcott's fear seemed genuine enough, but there was something specific about it that suggested more than general anxiety about grave robbing. As the morning progressed, 2 more disturbed graves were discovered, following exactly the same pattern. The perpetrator had worked with methodical care, lifting the heavy stones just enough to gain access to the coffin nameplates, then replacing everything as neatly as possible. Each grave showed the same telltale pry marks, the same precise technique that spoke of someone with considerable experience in handling stone and metal. It was while examining the second newly discovered grave that Miss Marple made her first significant observation. Crouched down beside the headstone, she noticed a small wedge-shaped chip of stone that had been discarded near the grave's edge. The chip was unremarkable in itself, but what caught her attention was a peculiar reddish-brown smear across its surface. She picked up the chip carefully, holding it close to examine the stain. The substance was greasy to the touch, and had a distinctive odour that she recognised immediately. Tallow, the rendered fat used in traditional candles and for waterproofing. It was quite different from the petroleum-based greases that modern workmen typically used. "Inspector," she called softly, and Slack approached with his characteristic impatience. "What is it, Miss Marple? Found something, have you?" "Perhaps," she said, showing him the stained chip. "This appears to be tallow, Inspector. Rather an old-fashioned substance for someone to be using in this sort of work." Slack examined the chip briefly, then shrugged. "Could be anything, really. Grease is grease, isn't it?" But Miss Marple was not convinced. In her methodical way, she had begun to catalogue the peculiarities of this case, and the use of tallow struck her as another piece of a puzzle that was proving more complex than it initially appeared. As the morning wore on, the little group was joined by several other villagers, drawn by the unusual activity in the normally peaceful churchyard. Among them was Oswald Pembury, a sturdy man in his 50s whose calloused hands and stone-dusted clothing immediately identified him as the local monument mason. Pembury had the blunt, no-nonsense manner of a craftsman who took pride in his work. "Terrible business this," he said, shaking his head as he surveyed the damaged graves. "Whoever did this knows something about stonework, I'll give them that. But it's not how I'd go about it, I can tell you." "Oh?" Inspector Slack looked up with interest. "How so?" Pembury knelt beside one of the disturbed slabs, running his experienced hands along the pry marks. "See here? They've worked the stone dry. No lubricant, no proper preparation. That's asking for cracks and chips. Any mason worth his salt would wet the joint first, use proper lifting gear. This is bodge work for all its neatness. Miss Marple listened to this professional assessment with great interest. You would never work in such a manner yourself, Mr. Pembury? Never, miss. Not if I wanted the stone to last. Mind you, he added thoughtfully, I suppose if someone was working in secret, they might not want to risk the noise of proper equipment. Just then another figure approached through the lich gate. A young woman with dark hair, pulled back practically and carrying a canvas satchel. This was Miranda Vane, who had recently moved to the village and made something of a name for herself with her blog about local history and genealogy. Good morning, she said, her voice slightly breathless from hurrying. I heard about the trouble here. How perfectly awful. Inspector Slack turned to her. You're the one who does those brass rubbings, aren't you? Miss Vane, is it? Yes, that's right, Miranda replied, her cheeks colouring slightly. I hope you don't think I had anything to do with this. I would never dream of disturbing actual graves. Course not, Slack said dismissively. Just wondering if you might have noticed anything unusual recently. People hanging about the churchyard, that sort of thing. Miranda shook her head. I'm usually here during the day, when I'm working on my research. I haven't seen anything suspicious. Miss Marple noticed that the young woman's hands trembled slightly as she spoke, and her eyes didn't quite meet the inspector's gaze. In her experience, people who claim to have seen nothing often prove to have observed a great deal indeed. As the group continued their examination of the disturbed graves, another figure appeared on the scene, Councillor Trevor Maddox, a smooth-faced man in his 40s whose well-tailored clothes and confident manner marked him as someone accustomed to being listened to. He approached with the measured stride of a man who considered himself an important person, with important business. Inspector Slack, he said, extending his hand, Trevor Maddox, parish council. Heard about this dreadful business. Thought I should come and see for myself. Councillor, Slack acknowledged. Any thoughts on who might be behind this? Maddox surveyed the scene with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating a business proposition. Well, it's clearly the work of someone with specific knowledge. Not random vandalism, certainly. Have you considered that this might be connected to the development proposals for the glebe land? There are always those who oppose progress, Inspector. Miss Marple found this observation interesting. The proposed housing development had been a subject of considerable discussion in the village, with strong opinions on both sides. The glebe land in question lay adjacent to the churchyard, and access to it had been a matter of some legal complexity due to ancient rights of way. You think someone's trying to cause trouble for your housing scheme? Inspector Slack asked. It's possible, Maddox replied carefully, though I can't imagine what disturbing old graves would accomplish in that regard. As the morning progressed and the initial excitement began to subside, Miss Marple found herself walking slowly among the affected graves, her trained eye searching for details that others might have missed. It was near the third disturbed grave that she made her most interesting discovery. Lying partially concealed beneath a low-growing juniper bush was another stone chip, similar to the first but larger. This one bore not only the same reddish-brown smear of tallow, but also what appeared to be traces of a different substance entirely, something with a distinctly metallic sheen that caught the morning light. She examined the chip carefully, holding it up to better see the strange marking. The metallic traces were green-tinged, with a characteristic patina that suggested old brass or copper that had been recently disturbed. Combined with the tallow, it painted a picture of someone working by candlelight or lantern with metal objects, precisely the sort of work that removing brass coffin plates would require. As she straightened up, Miss Marple became aware that she was being observed. Councillor Maddox stood a few yards away, his eyes fixed on the chip in her hand with an expression that seemed distinctly more than casual interest. "Found something else, have you, Miss Marple?" he asked, approaching with what might have been intended as a casual stroll. "Just another bit of stone," she replied mildly, slipping the chip into her pocket. "I'm afraid I have rather a habit of collecting curious things." But Maddox's eyes followed her hand to her pocket, and Miss Marple filed away the fact that he seemed unusually interested in what appeared to be nothing more than a piece of debris. The sun climbed higher, warming the ancient stones and bringing out the rich scents of earth, and growing things that always seemed stronger in churchyards. As the various officials went about their business, and the crowd of onlookers gradually dispersed, Miss Marple remained, walking slowly among the graves and thinking. Someone had indeed been very busy in St. Mildred's churchyard, but their purpose was becoming more mysterious rather than clearer. The selective nature of the theft, the professional skill evident in the stonework, and now these traces of old-fashioned materials all suggested a puzzle considerably more complex than simple grave robbing. Miss Marple had learned long ago that in matters of crime, the things that seemed most puzzling often proved to be the most revealing. As she made her way home for lunch, she found herself looking forward to discovering exactly what sort of logic lay behind this strange violation of the peaceful dead. Chapter 3. Marple Finds Wax. The following afternoon found Miss Marple returning to St. Mildred's churchyard, ostensibly to place fresh flowers on the grave of her old friend Miss Hartnell, but in reality drawn by the peculiar circumstances that continued to occupy her thoughts. The official investigation had concluded for the day, leaving the ancient burial ground to its accustomed peace, though the disturbed graves remained cordoned off with lengths of rope that fluttered gently in the autumn breeze. Miss Marple made her way slowly along the gravel path, pausing frequently to read inscriptions on the weathered headstones. It was a habit of hers, this careful observation of details that others might overlook, and she had found over the years that such attention often revealed far more than one might expect. As she approached the north wall of the churchyard, where the oldest graves lay beneath the spreading branches of an enormous yew tree, something caught her eye. Lying partially concealed beneath a low branch was what appeared to be a crumpled piece of tissue paper, the sort used for protecting delicate items. Miss Marple bent down carefully and retrieved the paper, noting immediately that it was heavier than the ordinary tissue and had a distinctive texture. As she unfolded it, she saw that one surface was darkened with what was unmistakably graphite dust, while several spots of red sealing wax had hardened onto the paper's surface. The combination was immediately familiar to anyone who had ever watched the ancient art of brass rubbing being performed. The graphite would be from the rubbing medium, charcoal or soft pencil used to transfer the raised design of memorial brasses onto paper, while the red wax would have been used to seal the edges of the paper to prevent slipping during the process. Most interesting, Miss Marple murmured to herself, carefully folding the paper and placing it in her handbag. She continued her circuit of the churchyard, and it was beneath the same ancient yew that she made her second discovery. Lying on the grass, so faint as to be almost invisible, unless one knew what to look for, was the ghostly impression of letters transferred in graphite. Kneeling down with some difficulty, Miss Marple could just make out the partial inscription, Eliza P., 1863. The significance of this was not lost on her. Someone had indeed been making brass rubbings in the churchyard, and recently enough that the graphite transfer had not yet been washed away by rain, or blown away by wind. Moreover, the partial inscription suggested that whoever had been doing the rubbing had been particularly interested in graves from the 1860s. Miss Marple was still examining the faint marking when footsteps on the gravel path announced the arrival of another visitor to the churchyard. Looking up, she saw Miranda Vane approaching, her canvas satchel slung over her shoulder, and her expression somewhat flustered. "Oh, Miss Marple," Miranda said, her cheeks distinctly pink. "I didn't expect to see anyone here. I just came to... That is, I thought I might have dropped something yesterday when all the commotion was going on." "Indeed?" Miss Marple straightened up slowly, her keen gaze fixed on the younger woman's face. "And did you find what you were looking for?" Miranda's colour deepened. "Well, no, actually. I'm not even certain I dropped anything. It's just that I'm always so careful with my equipment, and when I got home yesterday I noticed that one of my rubbing sheets seemed to be missing." Miss Marple's hand moved unconsciously to her handbag, where the crumpled tissue paper lay hidden. "How unfortunate. The sort of paper used for brass rubbings is rather specialised, I believe." "Yes, it is," Miranda agreed eagerly, seeming relieved to be discussing her work rather than her presence in the churchyard. I use a particular type of tissue paper, quite strong but thin enough to pick up fine detail. And of course one needs proper rubbing medium, graphite or charcoal, and wax to secure the paper while working. Red sealing wax? Miss Marple inquired casually. Miranda started slightly. Yes, red wax is traditional. How did you... Oh, of course, you probably know about these things. It's such an old craft after all. Miss Marple smiled gently. I find local history quite fascinating. You must have collected quite a number of rubbings from our churchyard. Oh, yes, Miranda said, her enthusiasm overcoming her earlier nervousness. Some wonderful examples here. Would you like to see them? To Miss Marple's surprise, Miranda opened her satchel and withdrew a leather portfolio, which she handed over with obvious pride. Inside were perhaps a dozen brass rubbings, each one carefully mounted and labelled. The work was of excellent quality, showing the intricate details of memorial brasses dating from the 15th century onwards. Miss Marple examined each rubbing carefully, noting the dates and names recorded. There were several from the 1800s, including inscriptions for various members of families whose descendants still lived in the village. But as she worked through the collection, she noticed something significant. There was no rubbing of Eliza Prideaux, 1863, despite the fact that she'd just found evidence of such a rubbing having been made. "These are beautifully done," Miss Marple said sincerely. "You have quite a talent for this work. I notice you have several from the 1860s period." "Yes, it was a particularly active decade for burials here," Miranda replied. "Some sort of fever epidemic, according to the parish records. There are quite a few monuments from that time, including Eliza Prideaux, I believe." Miranda's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple caught it. "Yes, I believe there is a Prideaux monument somewhere. I haven't gotten around to rubbing all of them yet." Miss Marple handed back the portfolio with a thoughtful expression. "Of course, such careful work must take considerable time, and I imagine one must be quite particular about weather conditions. No point attempting rubbings in the rain." "Exactly," Miranda agreed, clearly pleased to find someone who understood the technical aspects of her hobby. "I always check the weather forecast carefully before planning a session. Last week was perfect. Several clear, dry days in a row." After Miranda had departed, ostensibly to continue her search for the missing equipment, Miss Marple remained in the churchyard, thinking carefully about what she had learned. The evidence of recent brass rubbing activity, combined with Miranda's obvious nervousness and the specific absence of an Eliza Prideaux rubbing from her collection, suggested a connection between the young woman's hobby and the mysterious grave disturbances. But the connection was not yet clear. Miranda had seemed genuinely shocked by the news of the grave robbing, and her work, from what Miss Marple had seen, was entirely legitimate and respectful of the monuments. Yet the evidence of her recent activity in precisely the area where the thefts had occurred could hardly be dismissed as coincidence. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Miss Marple made her way slowly toward the church itself, her mind working methodically through the various threads of information she'd gathered. The tallow-stained chip suggested someone working by candlelight or lantern, which aligned with the mysterious light she and Mrs. Bantry had observed. The brass rubbing materials pointed to Miranda Vane, yet the young woman's collection was incomplete in a very specific way. Miss Marple paused at the church door, looking back over the peaceful churchyard where generations of villagers lay at rest. In her experience, crimes often had their roots in the past, and she was beginning to suspect that whoever was disturbing these particular graves was looking for something very specific, something connected to the careful records that brass plates and memorial inscriptions preserved. The question was what sort of information could be worth the considerable risk and effort involved in grave robbing, and why the mysterious perpetrator seemed to be focusing on burials from the 1860s. As she made her way home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple found herself thinking that the answer, when it came, might prove to be considerably more complex than a simple case of theft. The evening air carried the scent of wood smoke from cottage chimneys and the rich, earthy smell of autumn flowers. Somewhere in the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, she reflected, someone was harbouring a secret that had already led them to violate the sacred rest of the dead. Miss Marple had learned to trust her instincts about such matters, and those instincts were telling her that this particular secret might prove dangerous to the living as well. Chapter 4. 2 Registers. The next morning brought one of those crisp, clear days that made autumn in St. Mary Mead particularly beautiful. Miss Marple was enjoying her breakfast when Mrs. Clement arrived at her cottage, bearing a large leather-bound volume under her arm, and wearing an expression of considerable perplexity. "Jane, dear," said the vicar's wife, settling herself in the sitting-room with the book balanced carefully on her knees, "Leonard has asked me to bring you the parish burial register. He thought you might find it interesting, given your particular gift for noticing things that others miss." Miss Marple set down her teacup with interest. "How thoughtful of him. I take it this concerns our recent troubles at the churchyard." "Indeed it does," Mrs. Clement replied, opening the heavy volume carefully. "Leonard has been going through the records, trying to determine exactly which graves were disturbed and whether there might be any pattern to the selection. He's found something rather puzzling." The register was a magnificent old book, its pages yellowed with age and filled with the careful copperplate handwriting of successive parish clerks. Each entry recorded the essential details of burials going back nearly 2 centuries, names, dates, ages, and occasionally brief notes about circumstances or family connections. "Here," said Mrs. Clement, turning to a page dated 1863. "This is where things become interesting. Leonard found the entry for Eliza Prideaux. She was buried on September the 15th, 1863, aged 37. But when he checked against the diocesan copy of the records, he discovered a discrepancy." Miss Marple leaned forward with keen attention. "What sort of discrepancy?" Mrs. Clement produced a second, smaller volume from her handbag. "This is the transcript copy that was made for the diocese in 1920. Look here at the entry for Eliza Prideaux." Miss Marple examined both books carefully. In the original parish register, the entry was clear and unambiguous. Eliza Prideaux, widow, aged 37 years, buried September 15th, 1863. But in the diocesan transcript, the date had been recorded as September 15th, 1868. 5 years difference, Miss Marple murmured. "How very curious. Do you know which date is correct?" "Leonard is quite certain the original register is accurate," Mrs. Clement replied. "The handwriting is consistent with other entries from 1863, and there's a note in the margin referring to the fever epidemic of that year, which we know occurred in 1863, not 1868. Miss Marple studied the entries more closely, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the careful script. "Has Reverend Clement found any other discrepancies of this nature?" "That's what makes it so puzzling," Mrs. Clement said. "He's checked dozens of entries from the same period, and this appears to be the only error. Everything else matches perfectly between the 2 records." "How very singular," Miss Marple observed. "One might almost think it was a deliberate alteration rather than a simple copying error." Mrs. Clement looked troubled. "That's exactly what Leonard fears. But who would benefit from changing the burial date of a woman who died more than 60 years ago?" Miss Marple's mind was already working through the implications. In her experience, people rarely went to such elaborate lengths without a compelling reason, and the specific nature of this discrepancy suggested something more than mere antiquarian interest. "Mrs. Clement," she said carefully, "you mentioned that this concerns the disputed footpath across the glebe-land. Might this date change have some bearing on that legal matter?" The vicar's wife nodded gravely. "Leonard believes it might. You see, the legal status of the old footpath depends partly on proof of continuous burial activity across that particular strip of land. If Eliza Prideaux was indeed buried in 1863, her grave lies directly on the path route and helps establish the required historical precedent. But if she was buried in 1868, after the formal footpath designation was recorded, then her burial doesn't count toward the continuous use requirement. Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align in her mind. And without that precedent, the footpath's legal status becomes questionable. Exactly, which would clear the way for Councillor Maddox's proposed housing development. The access road he needs would run directly along the old footpath route. The significance of this revelation was not lost on Miss Marple. Someone with a considerable stake in the development project might indeed have reason to alter historical records, and the theft of Eliza Prideaux's coffin plate would effectively remove the physical evidence that might contradict the falsified transcript. "Has Councillor Maddox seen these registers?" Miss Marple inquired. "Oh yes," Mrs. Clement replied. "He requested access to them several weeks ago, claiming he needed to research the historical boundaries for his planning application. Leonard was happy to accommodate him. We had no reason to suspect anything untoward at the time." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The timing was certainly suggestive. Maddox's access to the records, followed by the mysterious alteration in the diocesan transcript, and then the targeted theft of the very coffin plate that would bear the correct date. It painted a picture of considerable premeditation. "Tell me," she said, "who would have had access to the diocesan transcript? Where is it normally kept?" "At the Cathedral Archives in Barchester," Mrs. Clement explained. "But copies are sometimes made available to researchers and local historians. Leonard requested this particular copy when he began investigating the footpath question." "And has anyone else expressed interest in examining it?" Mrs. Clement thought for a moment. "Well, that young woman who does the brass rubbings, Miss Vane, asked to see it last week. She said she was researching family connections for her genealogy blog, and I believe Councillor Maddox mentioned wanting to cross-reference some dates." Miss Marple made a mental note of this information. The web of connections was becoming increasingly complex, with Miranda Vane appearing at every turn, despite her apparent innocence. As Mrs. Clement prepared to leave, she paused at the door with a worried expression. "Jane, you don't really think someone has been deliberately falsifying these old records, do you? It seems so calculated." "I'm afraid that's exactly what I do think," Miss Marple replied gently, "and I suspect we haven't yet seen the full extent of their calculations." After Mrs. Clement's departure, Miss Marple spent the remainder of the morning walking slowly through the village, her mind working methodically through the various threads of information she'd gathered. The pattern was becoming clearer now: the selective theft of brass plates, the convenient alteration of a crucial date, and the strategic access to both sets of records by the very person who stood to benefit most from the confusion. But there were still elements that didn't quite fit. Miranda Vane's involvement, for instance, seemed both obvious and mysterious. Her presence at every significant point in the investigation could hardly be coincidence, yet her obvious nervousness and the genuine quality of her other work suggested she might be more pawn than player in whatever game was being conducted. As Miss Marple made her way past the village green, she encountered Dr. Haydock taking his daily constitutional. The elderly physician was one of her oldest friends in St. Mary Mead, and his practical medical mind often provided useful perspective on the more puzzling aspects of human behaviour. "Afternoon, Jane," he called out cheerfully. "Still pondering our churchyard mystery, I imagine?" "Indeed I am," Miss Marple replied. "Tell me, Doctor, in your experience, what sort of person goes to elaborate lengths to falsify historical records?" Dr. Haydock considered the question seriously. "Someone with a great deal at stake, I should think, and someone who believes they're clever enough to manipulate the truth without being detected. Dangerous combination, that. High stakes and overconfidence." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "And such a person might be willing to escalate their activities if they felt their plans were threatened?" The doctor's expression grew more serious. "I should think that's entirely possible. Why do you ask?" But Miss Marple had already begun to walk on, her mind occupied with the growing certainty that the grave robbing was only the beginning of a scheme that might prove considerably more dangerous before it was concluded. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village as she made her way home, and Miss Marple found herself thinking that whoever was behind these elaborate manipulations had chosen their target well. Few people paid close attention to the precise details of old burial records, and fewer still would have thought to compare different versions of the same information. But they had reckoned without the particular combination of circumstances that had brought the discrepancy to light, and without Miss Marple's talent for noticing the small details that others overlooked. As she reached her cottage gate, she paused to look back toward the church spire rising above the trees. Somewhere in the peaceful village, a carefully laid plan was beginning to unravel, and Miss Marple suspected that its architect would not surrender their ambitions without a fight. Chapter 5. Angel Down. The night that changed everything in St. Mary Mead began quietly enough. Miss Marple had retired early after a long day of contemplating the various threads of the churchyard mystery, but she was awakened shortly after midnight by the sound of shouting from the direction of the village centre. Living as she did so close to the heart of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned to distinguish between the various types of late-night disturbances that occasionally punctuated the village's usual tranquillity. This was not the good-natured revelry of young people returning from the pub, nor the urgent calls that accompanied medical emergencies. This was something altogether more alarming, a cry of genuine shock and fear. She rose quickly and made her way to her bedroom window, from which she could see across the village green toward the churchyard. Several lights were moving among the trees, and she could hear voices calling back and forth with a particular urgency that suggested something truly serious had occurred. Within minutes, Miss Marple had dressed and made her way out into the cool night air. The scene that greeted her at St. Mildred's churchyard was one of considerable confusion. Inspector Slack had already arrived, along with Dr. Haydock and several villagers who'd been drawn by the commotion. At the centre of the disturbance lay a sight that made Miss Marple catch her breath. The beautiful Weeping Angel monument that had stood guard over the Pemberton family graves for nearly a century had toppled over, and beneath its carved wings lay the motionless form of Councillor Trevor Maddox. "Stand back, all of you," Inspector Slack was saying, his voice sharp with authority. "This is a police matter now." Dr. Haydock was kneeling beside the fallen figure, his experienced hands checking for signs of life with professional efficiency. After what seemed an eternity, he looked up and shook his head gravely. "I'm afraid he's gone," the doctor announced quietly. "Appears to have been caught when the monument fell." Jonah Stiles, who had discovered the body during his late evening rounds of the churchyard, was standing nearby, his face pale with shock. "Terrible thing," he kept repeating. "Terrible thing to happen. That angel stood there for nigh on 100 years. Inspector Slack surveyed the scene with the methodical attention he brought to all such matters. "Accident, by the look of it. These old monuments aren't as stable as they appear. Probably been weakened by all the recent disturbance in the area." But Miss Marple, approaching the scene with her characteristic careful observation, noticed something that gave her pause. She knelt down beside the fallen monument, her sharp eyes taking in the details that others might overlook in the drama of the moment. The grass beneath where the angel's base had stood was still visible in the lantern light, and what she saw there struck her as distinctly odd. The blades of grass were neither crushed nor flattened in the way one would expect if a heavy stone monument had toppled naturally. Instead, they appeared to have been pressed down gradually, as though the monument had been lowered carefully rather than falling with sudden impact. "Inspector," she said quietly, "might I suggest examining the base of the monument more closely?" Slack looked irritated at the interruption. "Miss Marple, this is clearly a tragic accident. No need to complicate matters unnecessarily." But Dr. Haydock, who had learned to respect Miss Marple's observations over the years, approached with his medical bag and lantern. "What have you noticed, Jane?" Miss Marple pointed to the grass. "Look at the way the vegetation has been disturbed. If this monument had fallen suddenly, one would expect to see more dramatic crushing of the plant matter. This appears to have been compressed gradually over time." Dr. Haydock examined the area she indicated, his eyebrows rising as he took in the implications. "By Jove, you're right. This grass shows the pattern of long-term pressure, not sudden impact." It was then that Miss Marple made her second significant observation. Moving carefully around to examine the body of Councillor Maddox, she noticed something that caught the lantern light on his coat cuff, a fine, pale powder that seemed to shimmer slightly in the artificial illumination. "Dr. Haydock," she said, indicating the substance on the dead man's sleeve. "What do you make of this?" The doctor leaned closer, his professional eye trained on the unknown material. "Looks like some sort of chalk or limestone dust. And there," he pointed to another spot on Maddox's clothing, "that appears to be a greenish stain of some kind." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The pale powder looked very much like whiting, the chalk paste used by stonemasons for cleaning and polishing metal fittings on monuments. The greenish stain suggested contact with weathered brass or copper, precisely the sort of corrosion one would find on old coffin plates or memorial fittings. "Inspector," she said carefully, "I wonder if you might consider the possibility that Mr. Maddox's death was not entirely accidental." Slack turned to her with obvious frustration. "Miss Marple, we have a clear case here. Old monument, recent disturbances in the area weakening the foundations, unfortunate timing. These things happen." But Miss Marple was examining the monument's base more closely, and what she found there confirmed her growing suspicions. The stone showed no fresh chips or cracks that would indicate a sudden fall. Instead, the base appeared to have been carefully worked, with small tool marks that suggested deliberate manipulation. "The question," she said, more to herself than to the assembled group, "is why someone would go to such elaborate trouble to make a murder appear accidental." Dr. Haydock straightened up from his examination of the body. "Murder?" he said sharply. "Jane, what makes you think—" "The positioning," Miss Marple explained quietly. "Mr. Maddox is lying in exactly the right spot to have been crushed by the falling monument. But if the monument had been unstable for some time, as Inspector Slack suggests, what are the odds that Mr. Maddox would happen to be standing in precisely that location when it finally gave way?" As if to underscore her point, she gestured toward the rest of the churchyard. "Consider the space available. The monument could have fallen in any direction, and Mr. Maddox could have been anywhere in the vicinity, yet he ended up in the one position that would ensure fatal injury." Inspector Slack was beginning to look less certain of his initial assessment. "Well, these coincidences do happen." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed. "But in my experience, when coincidences involve violent death, they often prove to be considerably less coincidental than they first appear." As the small group continued their examination of the scene, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the timing of this apparent accident. Coming so soon after the discovery of the altered burial records and the theft of the crucial coffin plate, Maddox's death seemed almost too convenient to be mere chance. Moreover, the evidence of his recent contact with stoneworking materials suggested he had been actively involved in activities that aligned perfectly with the pattern of grave disturbance they had been investigating. The night air was growing colder, and the shadows cast by the lanterns seemed to make the churchyard feel more ominous than usual. Miss Marple looked around at the ancient monument standing silent in the darkness, and reflected that whoever was responsible for this elaborate scheme had chosen their setting well. But they had also, she suspected, made their first serious mistake. The careful precision that had characterized the grave robberies was absent from this scene, replaced by something that felt more like improvisation born of desperation. As the official investigation continued around her, Miss Marple found herself wondering what had prompted this escalation from theft to violence, and whether Councillor Maddox had been victim or conspirator in the events that led to his death beneath the Stone Angel's wings. Chapter 6. Footprints on You. Dawn broke grey and misty over St. Mary Mead, casting the churchyard in an ethereal light that seemed to emphasise the solemnity of the previous night's events. Miss Marple arrived early, having spent a restless night pondering the implications of Councillor Maddox's death, and she was pleased to find the scene relatively undisturbed by the morning's activities. The heavy dew that had settled during the night proved to be an unexpected ally in her investigation. As she approached the area around the fallen angel monument, Miss Marple noticed that the moisture had preserved a remarkably clear record of recent activity in the soft earth and fallen yew needles that carpeted much of the ground. Inspector Slack had not yet returned to continue his official investigation, which gave Miss Marple the opportunity to conduct her own careful examination of the physical evidence. She moved slowly around the perimeter of the scene, her experienced eye cataloguing every detail that might prove significant. The first thing that caught her attention was a distinct track pressed into the damp yew needles, running from the direction of the lich gate toward the fallen monument. The impression was narrow and regular, clearly made by the wheel of some sort of cart or barrow. More significantly, the track ran in only one direction, toward the monument, not away from it. Miss Marple followed the wheel track carefully, noting that it terminated at the exact spot where the angel had fallen. This suggested that whatever had been transported had been brought specifically to this location, rather than passing through as part of some routine maintenance activity. Near the base of the monument, the dew-laden ground revealed another set of marks that were even more intriguing. Impressed clearly in the soft earth were the outlines of footprints, not the heavy, hobnailed boots that she would have expected from a workman, but the distinctive pattern of crepe-soled shoes, the kind favoured by those who needed to move quietly. The footprints showed a curious pattern of movement, rather than the random distribution one might expect from someone working casually in the area. These prints formed a deliberate circuit around the monument's base, with several clear impressions clustered at the head end where the stone would have been most easily manipulated. Miss Marple knelt down carefully to examine the footprints more closely. The sole pattern was quite distinctive, a series of concentric circles that suggested good quality shoes, probably purchased from one of the better establishments in the nearby market town. More importantly, the spacing and depth of the impressions indicated someone of medium height and build, moving with careful deliberation rather than haste. As she continued her examination, Miss Marple became aware of approaching footsteps on the gravel path. Looking up, she saw Oswald Pembury making his way toward her, carrying his usual complement of tools and wearing his characteristic expression of professional concern. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called out as he approached. "Terrible business, this. Come to have a look at the damage to the angel I have. See if anything can be salvaged." Miss Marple rose from her examination of the footprints, noting automatically that Pembury's heavy work boots bore the traditional hobnailed pattern that was quite different from the crepe-soled impressions she had been studying. "Good morning, Mr. Pembury," she replied. "I'm afraid the damage appears to be quite extensive. Such a shame. It was a beautiful piece of work." Pembury approached the fallen monument with the careful gait of a man accustomed to working around heavy stone. Aye, that it was. Victorian craftsmanship at its finest. Whoever carved this knew their business. He paused, examining the break where the angel had separated from its base. Curious thing, though. "What do you find curious?" "Well," Pembury said, running his experienced hands along the fractured stone, "this break is clean. Too clean, if you take my meaning. Natural stone failure usually shows more splintering, more irregular patterns. This looks almost as though it was cut, then given just enough pressure to complete the separation." Miss Marple found this professional assessment extremely interesting. "You're suggesting the monument was deliberately weakened?" "I'm not suggesting anything definite, mind you," Pembury replied carefully. "But if I were hired to bring down a monument without making it obvious, this is very much how I might go about it." As they spoke, Miss Marple caught a distinctive scent emanating from the monument itself. A faint but unmistakable odour of linseed oil. It was the sort of smell one associated with the maintenance of stonework, where linseed was often used to treat and preserve metal fittings and tools. "Mr. Pembury," she said, "you use linseed oil in your work, don't you?" "Aye, that I do," he confirmed. "Essential for keeping metal dowels and fittings from rusting. Have to oil the joints regular-like, especially in weather like this." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, filing away this information alongside her growing collection of observations. The combination of professional stoneworking techniques, linseed oil, and the careful preparations suggested by the wheel tracks was beginning to paint a picture of considerable premeditation. It was then that she noticed something else that struck her as significant. Near the base of the monument, partially concealed by fallen leaves, was a small dark stain on one of the yew needles. Examining it more closely, she recognized the same reddish-brown substance she'd found on the stone chips near the disturbed graves. Tallow from old-fashioned candles. "How interesting," she murmured, carefully collecting the stained needle. "Found something else, have you?" Pembury asked, though his tone suggested more polite interest than genuine curiosity. "Just some evidence of recent activity," Miss Marple replied diplomatically. "Tell me, Mr. Pembury, have you been working in this area recently?" "Before last night, I mean." Pembury's response came perhaps a fraction too quickly. "No, miss. Haven't been near this section for weeks. Been busy with the restoration work on the south wall monuments." But Miss Marple had noticed something that made her question this assertion. On the monument's shoulder, where someone might naturally place their hand for support while working, was a clear smudge of what appeared to be linseed oil, fresh enough to still carry its distinctive scent. As morning progressed and other villagers began to arrive to view the scene of the tragedy, Miss Marple made her way toward the Lich Gate, following the wheel track she'd discovered earlier. The track was clearest near the gate itself, where the ground was softer, and it told an interesting story. The barrow or cart that had made these marks was not the heavy, iron-wheeled type typically used for transporting stone or construction materials. Instead, the impression suggested something with rubber tyres designed for quieter operation, rather like the wheeled bier that Jonah Styles used for moving flowers and maintenance supplies around the churchyard. Near the gate, Miss Marple found one final piece of evidence that seemed to complete the picture. Caught on a low branch of the hedge was a small fragment of cloth, dark wool, the sort used for working clothes, but with a distinctive weave that suggested quality material rather than the coarse fabric typically worn by manual labourers. As she made her way home for breakfast, Miss Marple reflected on the night's revelations. The evidence was beginning to suggest a carefully orchestrated plan, executed by someone with both the technical knowledge and the physical means to manipulate heavy stonework. More troubling still, the use of Jonah's bier and the presence of tallow suggested that the perpetrator had access to church property and was familiar with the traditions of the churchyard. The question that remained was whether Councillor Maddox had been an intended victim of this elaborate scheme, or whether he had stumbled upon something that made his elimination necessary. Either way, Miss Marple was becoming increasingly certain that the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead was harbouring a secret considerably more dangerous than simple grave robbing. Chapter 7. Midnight in the Crypt. The decision to maintain surveillance on St. Mildred's churchyard came to Miss Marple after a day of careful consideration. The evidence she had gathered suggested that whoever was behind the recent disturbances was far from finished with their nocturnal activities, and she'd learned over the years that criminals, particularly clever ones, often found it difficult to resist returning to the scene of their crimes. She enlisted the assistance of Sergeant Lake, a sensible young man who had proven amenable to her suggestions in previous investigations. Unlike Inspector Slack, Sergeant Lake had the wisdom to recognise that Miss Marple's unconventional methods often produced remarkable results. "We'll position ourselves near the old yew trees," Miss Marple explained as they made their preparations. "The shadow will provide adequate concealment, and we'll have a clear view of both the churchyard and the crypt entrance." The sergeant nodded, checking his torch and notebook. "What exactly are we watching for, Miss Marple?" "I rather suspect we'll know it when we see it," she replied, with the quiet confidence that came from decades of observing human nature. "But I have a feeling that tonight will provide some answers to our questions." They took up their positions shortly after 11 o'clock, settling themselves among the ancient headstones with the patience that successful observation required. The night was clear and cool, with enough moonlight to provide reasonable visibility across the churchyard. For nearly an hour, nothing disturbed the peaceful silence save the occasional rustle of small creatures moving through the undergrowth. Miss Marple had almost begun to wonder if her instincts had led her astray when a faint sound caught her attention. The soft scrape of a key turning in an old lock. Sergeant Lake heard it too, and they both turned toward the sound source. Near the north wall of the church, barely visible in the shadow of the building, a dark figure was carefully opening the door that led down to the ancient crypt. The figure moved with obvious familiarity, requiring no artificial light to navigate the entrance. This suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the church's layout, a regular visitor rather than an intruder. Miss Marple touched Sergeant Lake's arm lightly, signalling for patience. They watched as the figure disappeared into the crypt, leaving the door slightly ajar. A few moments later, a faint glow emanated from the opening, suggesting the use of a carefully shielded lantern. "Now," Miss Marple whispered, and they moved forward with the silent steps that careful practice had perfected. As they approached the crypt entrance, the sounds of activity below became clearer. Someone was moving about among the stone burial chambers, handling what sounded like metal objects with deliberate care. Sergeant Lake positioned himself at the top of the stone steps, while Miss Marple remained near the doorway where she could observe without being seen. The sergeant's hand rested on his truncheon, though Miss Marple suspected that force would not be necessary for what was about to unfold. "Jonah Styles," Sergeant Lake called out in his official voice, "please come up here immediately." The sounds from below ceased abruptly, followed by a moment of complete silence that seemed to stretch far longer than it actually lasted. Then came the heavy footsteps of someone climbing the stone stairs with obvious reluctance. Jonah Styles emerged from the crypt carrying a canvas bundle, his weathered face showing a mixture of resignation and something that might have been relief. In the lantern light, Miss Marple could see that his usually composed demeanour had given way to the expression of a man who had been carrying a considerable burden. "Sergeant," Jonah said quietly, setting down his bundle, "I suppose you'll be wanting an explanation." "Indeed we will," Sergeant Lake replied, though his tone was more curious than accusatory. "What exactly are you doing in the crypt at this hour?" Jonah looked around the small group, his gaze settling on Miss Marple with something approaching gratitude. "I've been keeping them safe," he said simply. "The brass plates. After the first ones went missing, I started lifting them myself and storing them down there." He gestured toward the bundle at his feet. 5 of them, wrapped in church tea towels to prevent scratching. I couldn't bear the thought of more of our history disappearing into some private collection. Sergeant Lake looked puzzled. "You mean you've been stealing the plates yourself?" "Not stealing," Jonah protested. "Protecting. I've been taking them up careful-like, after whoever's been doing the real damage had disturbed the graves. Couldn't leave them lying about for the press to sensationalise, could I?" Miss Marple stepped forward. "Show us what you've recovered, Mr. Styles." With obvious reluctance, Jonah unwrapped his bundle, revealing 5 brass coffin plates of various sizes and ages. Each had been carefully cleaned and polished, and they gleamed dully in the lantern light. "These are all the ones that were taken?" Miss Marple asked. "All the ones I could find," Jonah confirmed. "Went back after each disturbance and collected what was left behind. Thought it was better than leaving them lying about." Miss Marple examined the plates carefully, reading the inscribed names and dates. There was Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Tompkins, Sarah Wickham, and 2 others whose graves had been disturbed in the recent incidents. "Mr. Styles," she said thoughtfully, "you're certain these are all the plates you recovered?" Jonah nodded emphatically. "Every last one, Miss Marple. Checked each grave twice to be sure I hadn't missed anything." "And you never found a plate for Eliza Prideaux?" The sexton's expression grew troubled. "That's the curious thing, miss. I looked particularly careful for that one, seeing as how her grave was the first to be disturbed. But there was no plate there at all, not broken, not buried in the dirt, nothing, as if it had been taken clean away." Sergeant Lake was making notes in his official manner. "Mr. Styles, you realise that removing these items, even with good intentions, is a serious matter." I know it," Jonah replied heavily, "but I couldn't stand by and watch our history disappear. These plates are all that's left of people who lived and died in this village generations ago. Seemed wrong to let them vanish without trace." Miss Marple found herself oddly moved by the old sexton's confession. His actions, while technically improper, demonstrated a devotion to his responsibilities that went far beyond mere duty. "The question remains," she said gently, "who took the Eliza Prideaux plate, and why that one in particular?" Jonah shook his head helplessly. "I've been asking myself that same question, miss. Whoever it was, they knew exactly what they were after. Went straight to her grave, took what they wanted and left everything else behind." As they prepared to leave the crypt, Miss Marple reflected on this latest revelation. Jonah's well-intentioned salvage operation explained the disappearance of most of the brass plates, but it also confirmed that the Eliza Prideaux plate had been specifically targeted by someone else entirely. The pattern was becoming clearer now. Someone with a particular interest in that one grave, that one date, had orchestrated the theft with considerable precision. The other disturbances had been camouflage, designed to make the theft of Eliza's plate appear part of a general pattern of vandalism. As they walked back through the quiet churchyard, Miss Marple found herself thinking that they were very close to understanding the full scope of the deception that had been practiced upon the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead. The question that remained was whether they would discover the truth before whoever was behind it decided that further violence was necessary to protect their secret. Chapter 8. Burnt Rubbing. The morning following Jonah Styles' confession found Miss Marple in thoughtful mood as she made her way to the vicarage for her weekly visit with Mrs. Clement. The revelation that the sexton had been conducting his own salvage operation had clarified certain aspects of the mystery, but it had also sharpened her focus on the one missing piece that seemed to be at the heart of everything: the brass plate of Eliza Prideaux. Mrs. Clement greeted her at the door with her usual warmth, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension in the vicar's wife that suggested the recent events were taking their toll on the entire household. "Jane, dear," Mrs. Clement said as she led the way into the sitting room, "I'm so glad you've come. Leonard has been quite beside himself about all this business. He feels responsible somehow for not protecting the churchyard properly." Miss Marple settled herself comfortably and accepted the offered cup of tea. "Reverend Clement is hardly to blame for the actions of others. Has he discovered anything further about the parish records?" "Actually, yes," Mrs. Clement replied, lowering her voice slightly. "That's partly why I'm so glad you're here. Leonard made a rather disturbing discovery yesterday evening." Before she could elaborate, the sound of footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of Reverend Clement himself. The vicar appeared in the doorway looking distinctly haggard, his usually immaculate clerical dress somewhat dishevelled. "Miss Marple," he said with obvious relief, "Mrs. Clement has told you about our discovery." "She was just beginning to explain," Miss Marple replied gently. "What have you found?" Reverend Clement sat down heavily in his armchair. "I was cleaning out the vestry stove yesterday evening, preparing it for the colder weather, when I found something rather alarming in the ash chamber." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small envelope which he handed to Miss Marple with trembling fingers. "These are the remains of what appears to have been a brass rubbing. The paper is almost entirely burnt, but a few fragments survived." Miss Marple opened the envelope carefully and examined the charred pieces within. Most were too damaged to reveal anything useful, but one corner piece, perhaps 2 inches square, showed clear evidence of the graphite transfer technique used in brass rubbing. More significantly, she could make out partial lettering that appeared to read DO 186. "Prideaux," she murmured, the significance immediately apparent. This was a rubbing of Eliza Prideaux's memorial brass. "That's what we thought," Reverend Clement confirmed. "But who would make such a rubbing and then burn it in our vestry stove?" Mrs. Clement leaned forward anxiously. "Leonard found something else mixed in with the ash. Show her, dear." The vicar produced a second envelope containing several hardened blobs of red sealing wax, partially melted but still recognisable. "This was used to attach the rubbing paper during the process," he explained. Miss Marple examined the wax carefully. It was the same distinctive red colour she had observed on the tissue paper she had found beneath the yew tree, and the blobs were clearly the remnants of the traditional method used to secure paper during brass rubbing. "Has anyone asked to use the vestry recently?" Miss Marple inquired. Mrs. Clement and her husband exchanged glances. "Well, yes, actually," Mrs. Clement said slowly. "Miss Vane asked if she might store some of her research materials there temporarily. Said her cottage was rather damp and she was worried about damage to her work." "And did you accommodate her request?" "Of course," Reverend Clement replied. "She seemed such a dedicated young scholar. Leonard gave her a key so she could access her materials at convenient times." Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to arrange themselves in her mind. When did Miss Vane make this request? About 2 weeks ago, Mrs. Clement answered. She said she was working on a particularly important project about local genealogy and needed secure storage for her documents. The timing was significant. 2 weeks ago would have been shortly before the first grave disturbances and well before any public knowledge of the discrepancy in the burial records. "Tell me," Miss Marple said carefully, "did Miss Vane ever show you this important project she was working on?" Reverend Clement shook his head. "No, she was rather secretive about it. Said she wanted to be certain of her facts before sharing her research with anyone." Miss Marple rose from her chair with the air of someone who had reached an important decision. "I think it might be beneficial to have a conversation with Miss Vane. Would it be possible to visit her cottage this morning?" "Certainly," Mrs. Clement replied, though she looked puzzled. "But do you really think she's involved in all this unpleasantness?" "I think," Miss Marple said diplomatically, "that Miss Vane may have information that could prove very helpful to our investigation." The walk to Miranda Vane's cottage took them past the churchyard, where the fallen angel monument remained cordoned off and the investigation into Councillor Maddox's death continued. Miss Marple paused briefly to observe the scene, noting that fresh flowers had been placed near the site, a touching gesture from the villagers, regardless of their opinion of the deceased councillor's development plans. Miranda's cottage proved to be a neat, modest dwelling on the outskirts of the village, with the sort of well-tended garden that suggested careful attention to detail. Mrs. Clement knocked on the front door, and after a moment's delay it was opened by Miranda herself. The young woman's face showed immediate alarm at the sight of her visitors, and Miss Marple noted the telltale signs of recent stress: shadows under her eyes, a slight tremor in her hands, and the general air of someone who had not been sleeping well. "Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple," Miranda said, her voice higher than usual. How nice to see you. Please, come in." The cottage's interior was as neat as its exterior, but Miss Marple's experienced eye immediately detected signs of a recent disturbance. Books and papers were stacked somewhat haphazardly on the table, as though someone had been going through them hurriedly, and there was a faint smell of burnt paper that seemed to linger in the air. "Miss Vane," Miss Marple began gently, "we've come to ask you about a brass rubbing that was recently burned in the church vestry. I believe you may know something about it." Miranda's composure cracked visibly. She sank into a chair, her face pale and her hands trembling more noticeably. I don't know what you mean." "The rubbing of Eliza Prideaux's memorial brass," Miss Marple continued with quiet persistence. "The one you made approximately a week ago, before it was purchased from you by someone claiming genealogical interest." The effect of these words on Miranda was dramatic. She began to cry, not the gentle tears of feminine distress, but the hard, frightened sobs of someone who had been carrying a terrible burden. "I never meant for anyone to be hurt," she managed between sobs. "I thought it was just harmless research. He said he was tracing family connections, that he needed the rubbing for his records." Mrs. Clement moved to comfort the distraught young woman, while Miss Marple waited patiently for the emotional storm to subside. When Miranda had regained some measure of control, Miss Marple spoke again. "Who purchased the rubbing from you, Miss Vane?" Miranda looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Councillor Maddox. He came to me about 10 days ago, said he'd heard about my genealogy work and wondered if I might help him trace some family connections. He was particularly interested in the Prideaux family, said they might be distant relatives." "And you made the rubbing for him?" "Yes. He was very specific about what he wanted. The complete inscription, perfect detail. He paid me quite generously for the work." Miranda's voice grew smaller. Then, a few days later, he came back and asked to purchase the rubbing itself, said he wanted to have it framed as a memento. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And you agreed to the sale?" "He offered such a substantial sum, and I still had my notes about the inscription. I thought there was no harm in it." Miranda's voice broke again. "But then the grave started being disturbed, and I began to worry that I might have inadvertently helped someone with improper intentions." The full picture was becoming clear to Miss Marple now. Maddox had used Miranda's legitimate expertise to obtain a perfect copy of Eliza Prideaux's memorial inscription, then had somehow obtained the actual brass plate to eliminate the physical evidence. But something had gone wrong with his carefully laid plans, leading to his death beneath the Angel Monument. As they prepared to leave the cottage, Miss Marple reflected that they now had a clear connection between the mysterious buyer of the brass rubbing and the man who lay dead in the churchyard. The question that remained was who had killed Councillor Maddox, and whether that person represented a threat to anyone else who had become entangled in this web of historical deception. Chapter 9, Wrong Chips. Dr. Haydock's post-mortem examination of Councillor Maddox proved to be more revealing than anyone had anticipated. Miss Marple received the news of his findings through Inspector Slack, who appeared at her cottage door that afternoon wearing an expression of considerable perplexity. "The doctor's findings don't match what we expected," Slack announced without preamble, settling himself in Miss Marple's sitting room with the air of a man grappling with unwelcome complications. "Maddox wasn't crushed by the falling monument as we initially assumed." Miss Marple set down her knitting with interest. "Indeed? What did Dr. Haydock discover?" "Single blow to the back of the head," Slack replied grimly. "Round impact, probably from some sort of wooden implement. The stone angel falling on him was... well, it happened after he was already dead." This confirmation of her earlier suspicions did not surprise Miss Marple, though she was careful not to appear too knowing. "How very disturbing. Have you examined the monument itself for evidence of how it came to fall?" "That's another puzzle," Slack admitted. "The base shows no fresh damage, no chips or cracks that would indicate sudden structural failure. And we found precious few stone fragments around the site, which is odd if the thing toppled naturally." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "One would expect considerable debris from such an impact." "Exactly. Dr. Haydock and I examined what chips we could find, and they all show weathering consistent with having been broken off months or even years ago. Nothing fresh at all." This information fitted perfectly with Miss Marple's growing understanding of the case. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to stage Maddox's death as an accident, but their preparations had been necessarily incomplete. "Tell me, Inspector," she said carefully, "have you examined Mr. Pembury's workshop? Given his expertise with stonework, it might be useful to eliminate him from consideration." Slack's expression suggested he found this line of inquiry somewhat tedious. "Yes, we've had a look. His tools are all clean and properly stored. No blood, no recent damage. Even checked his hand barrow, the wooden one he uses for moving heavy pieces. Hasn't been moved in days, judging by the undisturbed dust and spider webs." Miss Marple filed away this information, though something about the mention of Pembury's barrow stirred a memory from her earlier observations. "Does Mr. Pembury use any other type of cart or trolley?" "Just the one wooden barrow as far as we know. Why do you ask?" "Oh, I'm merely curious about the various equipment available in the churchyard," Miss Marple replied diplomatically. "I noticed some wheel tracks the morning after Mr. Maddox's death." After Inspector Slack departed, Miss Marple spent some time in quiet contemplation, reviewing the various pieces of evidence she had collected. The post-mortem findings confirmed that Maddox had been murdered, but they also raised new questions about the method and timing of the crime. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Jonah Styles, who appeared at her garden gate looking troubled and carrying a small canvas bag. "Miss Marple," he called out respectfully, "might I have a word?" "There's something been bothering me about all this business." Miss Marple invited him in, noting that the sexton seemed more agitated than usual. His weather-beaten hands showed signs of recent work, and she caught the faint scent of tallow and metal polish that had become familiar over the past week. "What's troubling you, Mr. Styles?" Jonah set down his bag and pulled out what appeared to be a small wooden mallet with a round head. "It's my setting maul, miss. I use it for gentle work, adjusting stones, tapping dowels into place. Yesterday morning I found it wasn't where I left it." Miss Marple examined the tool with interest. It was clearly old and well used, its wooden head worn smooth by years of careful work. More significantly, it was exactly the sort of implement that could deliver the round, concentrated blow that Dr. Haydock had described. Where do you normally keep it? In the tool shed, alongside the church wall. Always has its proper place on the rack. But when I went to use it yesterday morning, it was sitting on the workbench instead, not hung up proper like. And you're certain you didn't leave it there yourself? Jonah shook his head emphatically. Never, miss. Been using that tool for 20 years and I always hang it in its place. Someone else handled it, and recent-like. Miss Marple turned the mallet over in her hands, noting that while it appeared clean, there were faint marks on the wooden head that might have been scrubbed away hastily. Mr. Styles, you mentioned the smell of tallow on some of the stone chips near the disturbed graves. Do you use tallow in your regular work? Aye, that I do, Jonah confirmed. Old-fashioned, perhaps, but it works better than modern grease for some jobs. Use it on the beer wheels especially. Keeps them turning smooth and quiet-like. This caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. Your beer has tallow on the wheels? Fresh coat just this week, Jonah said proudly. Part of my regular maintenance. Can't have squeaky wheels during funeral services. Miss Marple felt another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The wheel tracks she had observed leading from the lich gate to the fallen monument suddenly made more sense. Someone had used Jonah's carefully maintained beer to transport Maddox's body after the murder, then had tipped the prepared monument onto him to simulate an accident. Mr. Styles, she said gently, might we examine your beer together? They made their way to the churchyard where Jonah's wheeled beer stood in its usual place beside the tool shed. Miss Marple examined the wheels carefully, noting the fresh coating of tallow that Jonah had mentioned. But there was something else that caught her eye. Traces of yew needles and small fragments of grass caught in the wheel treads. Do you recall moving the bear through the area near the yew trees recently? Jonah looked puzzled. No, miss. Haven't had occasion to use it in that part of the churchyard for weeks. Keep it mainly on the gravel paths for services and such. Miss Marple knelt down to examine the wheel treads more closely. The plant matter caught that was consistent with the route from the lich gate to the fallen monument, exactly the path shown by the track she'd observed in the dew-laden ground. Someone borrowed your beer without permission, she concluded, and they had access to your tools as well. As they walked back toward the church, Miss Marple found herself thinking about who would have had access to both Jonah's equipment and the knowledge necessary to manipulate the monument. The answer was becoming increasingly clear, though the motive remained somewhat puzzling. Mr. Styles, she said as they reached the church door, you mentioned that Mr. Pembury has been helping with restoration work recently. Does he have access to your tool shed? Aye, that he does, Jonah confirmed. Gave him a key weeks ago so he could borrow equipment as needed. Professional courtesy, you might say. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The picture was becoming clearer now. Pembury had access to both the tools and the beer. He possessed the technical knowledge to manipulate the monument, and his hands would naturally carry the scent of linseed oil from his regular work. But the question that remained was why a respectable craftsman like Oswald Pembury would become involved in murder. The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay in understanding exactly what Councillor Maddox had been doing in the churchyard on the night of his death, and why that activity had led someone to strike him down with Jonah's setting maul. As evening approached and the shadows lengthened across the peaceful churchyard, Miss Marple reflected that they were very close to understanding the full truth of what had happened in St. Mary Mead. The final revelation she suspected would prove both more complex and more human than anyone had yet imagined. Chapter 10. Grave Truth. Dawn was breaking over St. Mary Mead when Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard for what she suspected would be the final act of this peculiar drama. She had spent much of the night arranging her thoughts, and was now ready to put her theory to the test. Inspector Slack had been summoned, along with Dr. Haydock, and they found Miss Marple standing beside the fallen angel monument, her keen eyes surveying the scene with the methodical attention that had served her so well over the years. Right then, Miss Marple, Inspector Slack said with barely concealed impatience, you said you had something important to show us about this business. Indeed I do, Miss Marple replied calmly. But first, I think it would be helpful if Mr. Pembury could join us. This concerns him rather directly. Slack looked sceptical, but dispatched Sergeant Lake to fetch the monument mason. Within a few minutes, Oswald Pembury appeared. his solid frame and work-stained clothing a familiar sight in the churchyard. His expression was carefully neutral, though Miss Marple detected a certain wariness in his manner. "Gentlemen," Miss Marple began, "we have been investigating what appeared to be a series of grave robberies, followed by a tragic accident. I believe the truth is considerably more complex than either of those explanations would suggest." She gestured toward the fallen monument. This case began with Councillor Maddox's ambitious housing development and his need to resolve a legal obstacle, the ancient footpath that runs across his proposed building site. Dr. Haydock nodded. "The one that depends on proof of continuous burial activity." "Precisely. Mr. Maddox discovered that the legal status of that footpath hinged on a single burial record, that of Eliza Prideaux in 1863. If her burial date could be successfully challenged or obscured, the footpath's historical precedent would be undermined." Miss Marple paused, allowing this to sink in before continuing. Mr. Maddox's scheme was elaborate but carefully thought out. First, he commissioned Miss Vane to create a brass rubbing of Eliza's memorial plate, ostensibly for genealogical research. This gave him a perfect record of the inscription, including the crucial date. Pembury shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "Next," Miss Marple continued, "he needed to remove the physical evidence, the brass plate itself, while making it appear part of a general pattern of vandalism. Hence the disturbances at multiple graves, designed to camouflage his specific target." Inspector Slack was beginning to look interested despite himself. "And you think Maddox was doing this work himself?" "Initially, yes, but Mr. Maddox was no stonemason. When it came to the more technical aspects of his plan, particularly the preparation of this monument to serve as his murder weapon, he required professional assistance." All eyes turned to Pembury, whose face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. "You approached Mr. Pembury several weeks ago," Miss Marple said, addressing the monument mason directly, "with a proposal for restoration work on this angel. In reality, you wanted him to weaken the monument's attachment to its base, creating the potential for what would appear to be a tragic accident." Pembury's hands clenched into fists. "That's not. I never agreed to anything like that." "No," Miss Marple agreed gently. "I don't believe you did. I think you agreed to legitimate restoration work, not realizing Mr. Maddox's true intentions. But when you discovered what he was really planning, you felt responsible for enabling his scheme." She gestured toward the evidence around them. The tallow on Jonah's beer wheels, the linseed oil on the monument's shoulder, the careful way the stone was lowered rather than allowed to fall, all point to someone with your professional skills and access to church equipment. Dr. Haydock looked puzzled. "But why would Pembury kill Maddox if he was working with him?" "Because," Miss Marple explained, "Mr. Pembury discovered that Mr. Maddox intended to use the prepared monument, not just to fake an accident, but to commit murder. Perhaps he overheard conversation, or perhaps Mr. Maddox became careless about concealing his true intentions." Pembury's composure finally cracked. "He told me it was about scaring off the protesters," he said heavily. "Said if there was an accident in the churchyard, people would stop opposing his development. I thought he meant to stage something minor, make the place seem unsafe. But you learned differently. The night he died, I saw him heading for the churchyard with a crowbar and heard him talking to someone on his telephone. He was planning to murder Miss Vane, said she knew too much about the brass rubbing business, and was starting to ask awkward questions." Miss Marple nodded sadly. "So you followed him to prevent a greater crime?" "I confronted him by the angel," Pembury continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Told him I wouldn't be party to murder, threatened to expose the whole scheme. He laughed, said I was already an accessory and no one would believe my word against his. And then he swung the crowbar at me. I had Jonah's setting maul with me. I'd borrowed it to make some final adjustments to the monument's base. When he came at me, Pembury's voice trailed off. "You defended yourself," Miss Marple said quietly. "The blow was defensive, not premeditated." Inspector Slack stepped forward. "Then why the elaborate staging with the monument?" Pembury looked up with anguished eyes. "Panic, I suppose. I realised what I'd done. and all I could think about was my family, my business. So I used the beer to move his body under the angel, then lowered the stone down on him. Made it look like the accident he'd originally planned. Using the monument you had prepared at his request, Miss Marple observed. There's a certain justice in that, I suppose. As Inspector Slack began the formal process of arrest, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the human cost of Maddox's ambitious scheme. A man had died, another faced imprisonment, and an entire village had been disrupted, all for the sake of a housing development that would probably never be built now. Mrs. Bantry arrived as the official procedures were concluding, having heard the news from her cook, who had it from the postman. She stood beside Miss Marple, watching as Pembury was led away with quiet dignity. "Such a terrible waste," Mrs. Bantry murmured. "A whole housing estate balanced on one poor woman's burial plate." Miss Marple smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from her coat. "The living will always try to rearrange the past, my dear Dolly, but churchyards are very stubborn about the truth." As they walked away from the scene, Miss Marple reflected that the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead would soon return to its normal rhythm. The graves would be properly restored, the monument repaired, and the ancient footpath would continue to wind its way across the glebe land as it had for centuries past. Sometimes, she thought, the dead protected themselves more effectively than the living ever could. Eliza Prideaux would rest undisturbed now, her burial date secure in the parish records and her memorial plate restored to its rightful place. The truth, as Miss Marple had learned long ago, had a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how deeply some people tried to bury it. The morning sun climbed higher over the churchyard, warming the ancient stones and bringing out the rich scents of earth and growing things that spoke of continuity and peace. In St. Mary Mead, at least, the past would remain safely where it belonged.